The morning the Dowager Countess summoned the household to the great hall of Wellborn, the rain had not yet stopped, and Esther Whitcomb stood at the back of the assembled servants with her hands folded and her heart beating where she could feel it in her throat. She had been at the house 11 days. She knew the names of perhaps half the people standing near her. She did not yet know the rules of the place, only that there was one rule above all the others, and it was the rule that nobody crossed Lady Cowford. Not the butler, not the steward, not the Earl himself, who stood now at the cold end of the hall with his face turned toward the tall windows and the gray light beyond them. A girl had been accused. Her name was Mary Tace. 14 years old, a scullery maid with chapped hands and a habit of singing under her breath when she thought no one could hear her. A brooch had gone missing from the morning room, a small thing of garnet and gold that had belonged to the late Countess, and Lady Cowford had decided, with the swiftness of a woman who had never in her life been required to be uncertain, that Mary had taken it. The girl stood in the center of the hall, now white to the lips, and she was not crying, which somehow made it worse to watch. To the household, Esther was just a new maid, country-bred and quiet, a pair of hands hired in autumn to carry coal and turn mattresses and disappear. That was the whole of her, as far as anyone above stairs was concerned. What none of them knew was that she had buried her mother 6 months before, and learned in the burying of her exactly how much a single truth could cost and exactly how much worse the cost of swallowing it. Lady Cowford spoke. Her voice was low and even, and carried to every corner of the hall without effort, the way the voices of people accustomed to silence always do. The girl would be turned out before noon, she said, without a character, and the magistrate would be informed should the brooch not be returned. She said it the way she might have said the weather had turned. Then she looked at Mary as though the matter were already concluded, and the household lowered its collective eyes, and the rain went on against the glass. Esther had seen Mary the night the brooch went missing. That was the thing nobody knew. She had been carrying a candle down the back stair near 11, and she had passed the morning-room door, and she had seen who came out of it, and it had not been Mary Tace. She felt her own breath go shallow. She felt the floor of her stomach drop away as it had dropped away once before at a graveside, when she had understood that the thing she knew could not be unknown and could not be set down. The other servants were beginning to shift, to turn, the moment passing into the next moment, Mary's life closing like a door. And Esther understood that if she said nothing now, she would carry it the way she carried the other one into every quiet hour for the rest of her life. She stepped forward. The movement was small. A single pace out of the line of servants, no more. But in that hall it was as though a stone had been dropped into still water, and every face turned toward her. Lady Cowford's gaze settled on her with a slow, cold curiosity, as one might regard an insect that had managed improbably to make a sound. "My lady," Esther said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "Mary did not take the brooch. I saw who came from the morning room that night, and it was not Mary." The silence that followed had a texture. It pressed on the ears. Somewhere near the kitchens a pot was set down too hard, and the sound of it rang through the stone like a struck bell, and still nobody moved. Lady Cowford's fan, which had been moving in a small idle rhythm near her wrist, went still. Across the hall, at the cold end where the gray light fell, the Earl of Cowford turned his head. He had not turned for the accusation. He had not turned for his mother's verdict. He turned now, and his eyes found the back of the hall and the new maid standing a single pace out of her line, and something moved in his face that none of the watching servants could have named, because it was gone almost before it arrived. Esther did not see it. She was looking at the Dowager. The housekeeper, Mrs. Penrose, saw it, and she filed it away in the place where she kept the things she was not paid to notice. "And who," said Lady Cowford, "are you?" It was not truly a question. It was a way of reminding the hall, and the maid, and perhaps herself, of the order of things. Esther understood that. She had grown up the daughter of a seamstress, in a town where the order of things was understood by everyone and softened by no one, and she knew exactly how small she was being made to feel, and she answered anyway. "Esther Whitcomb, my lady." "I came in October, a housemaid of 11 days, Lady Calvert said, and let the words sit, and the household understood them. A housemaid of 11 days had no business in the great hall, with an opinion in her mouth. A housemaid of 11 days saw what she was told to see. The dowager's mouth curved into something that was not a smile. "And you would have me believe that you, rather than the entire household, rather than my own steward, have the truth of this." "I would have you believe what I saw," Esther said. "That is all I have to offer. Yet I cannot stand here and watch a girl turned out for a thing she did not do. If you have ever stood in a room where one small person refused to bend and felt the air in the room change because of it, then you know what the servants of Wellborn felt that morning, and you will understand why some of them remembered it for the rest of their lives. Stay with this story. What that refusal set in motion was not what any of them expected, least of all the maid who began it. Lady Calvert did not have the girl removed. That was the first surprise, though Esther was too frightened to register it as one. The dowager studied her for a long moment, and then she said that the matter would be looked into, and that Esther would hold herself ready to repeat her claim, and that the household might return to its work. She said it as a queen grants a stay of execution, to demonstrate that the granting was hers to do. Then she swept from the hall with her companion and her fan, and the servants scattered like birds, and Mary Tay stood in the center of the emptying room with her hands pressed to her mouth. And Esther went to her, and the girl gripped her sleeve and would not let go. "You should not have," Mary whispered. "You should not have done it. She will find a way to be rid of you now. She always does." "Perhaps," Esther said. "Even so, you will eat your dinner tonight, and you will sleep in your own bed, and that is worth a great deal." She did not feel as brave as she sounded. Her hands had begun to tremble now that the moment had passed, the way they always did afterward, and she pressed them flat against her apron until the shaking stopped. In her pocket, where it always was a small brass thimble worn smooth at the crown, her mother's. The one object she had kept when everything else was sold. She closed her fingers around it through the cloth. It was a habit she did not examine. It steadied her. Wellborn was a house built to impress and to intimidate, 3 stories of pale stone set in a park of old oaks, with a long gravel sweep and a dry fountain. The late Earl had died when his son was a boy, and the late Countess, the Earl's first wife, had died 3 years past, and since then the house had belonged in every meaningful way to the dowager, who governed it as she governed everything, by the assumption that her will was the natural law of the place. The present Earl Adrian kept to his study, and his land, and his long silences, and the household had learned to read his moods the way sailors read weather, and to expect nothing of him in the way of warmth. Esther had been raised on warmth, or on the memory of it. Her father had died when she was small, and she scarcely recalled him. But her mother had been a seamstress of uncommon skill and tenderness, and they had been poor together in a way that never once felt poor until the end, when the work grew scarce and the cough came and stayed. Esther had nursed her through a long winter. She had learned in that winter to do hard things with steady hands. She had also learned the lesson that had brought her to this hall this morning, though she would not have put it in words, the lesson that there are things a person cannot watch happen and remain themselves. The work of a housemaid was endless and invisible, and Esther was good at it. She rose before the light, and laid the fires, and carried the cans of hot water, and beat the carpets, and polished the brass, until her arms ached. And she did it without complaint, because the work was honest, and kept her hands busy, and her mind quiet. The other servants warmed to her slowly. Mrs. Penrose, the housekeeper, a spare gray woman with a face like a closed account book, watched her for the first weeks and said little, but Esther caught her once, nodding to herself after Esther had set a difficult tray to rights, and she understood that she had passed some private test. It was 3 days after the great hall that she encountered the Earl directly for the first time. She had been sent to lay the fire in the library, an enormous room with bookshelves rising floor to ceiling, and a tall, cold hearth, and she had thought the room empty. She was on her knees at the grate, her sleeves pushed back soot to the elbow, when a voice behind her said, "You are the maid who spoke." She came to her feet too quickly and nearly upset the coal scuttle. He stood in the doorway, very tall, in a dark coat, his face in shadow against the brighter hall behind him. She could not read it. She dropped a curtsy and kept her eyes down, as she had been taught. "Yes, my lord." Why? The single word hung in the cold air. She had expected reprimand or dismissal, or the particular cold courtesy with which the great spoke to the small, and she had not expected to be asked why, as though her reason were a thing worth the having. She looked up before she could stop herself. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that had nothing of cruelty in it, and everything of a question genuinely asked. "Because it was true, my lord," she said, "and because she is 14, and had no one." He was quiet. The fire she had not yet lit lay dead in the grate between them. Then he said, "My mother does not forgive being contradicted." "I know it, my lord, and you did it anyway." "I would do it again," Esther said, and then heard herself and added more quietly, "Begging your pardon." Something happened at the corner of his mouth, the smallest possible movement there, and gone. He crossed the room, and she stepped back to give him room, and he stood at the window with his back to her and looked out at the bare park. "The brooch was found," he said, "in the room of my mother's companion, where it had been the whole time. The companion has been dismissed. Mary Tace keeps her place." He paused. "You were right." Esther said nothing. There seemed nothing to say that would not be either triumph or servility, and she wanted neither. "Light the fire," he said, and his voice had gone level and cold again, the warmth of the question withdrawn as though it had embarrassed him. "And then go." She lit the fire. Her hands were steady. When she rose to leave, she glanced once at his profile against the gray window, the hard line of his jaw, the stillness of him, like stone over moving water, and she thought that she had never seen a man so guarded. And she wondered, in the brief way one wonders about the unknowable lives of the great, what he was guarding. She would learn. It would take her the better part of the winter, and it would cost them both more than either of them yet understood. But she would learn. Word of the great hall had spread below stairs, of course, and it changed Esther's standing among the servants in ways both good and difficult. Mary Tace adored her with the open, total devotion of a rescued child. The older women treated her with a new respect threaded through with wariness, for she had done a thing that frightened them, had reminded them that the bending they all practiced was a choice and not a law. And people do not always thank you for that. And Lady Cafford, Esther understood without being told, had not forgotten, and had not forgiven. The dowager was not a woman who struck quickly. She was a woman who waited and arranged and let the natural order reassert itself in its own time, and then appeared to have had nothing to do with it. The Earl began to be in rooms where Esther was working. It was not obvious at first, and never anything she could have named to another person without sounding as though she had lost her senses. He took to reading in the library in the mornings when the fires were laid. He walked in the long gallery where she dusted the picture frames. Once, when she was carrying a heavy ewer up the back stair, she found him descending it, a stair no member of the family used, and he took the ewer from her hands without a word, and carried it to the landing, and set it down and went on his way before she could so much as thank him. She stood on the landing with her empty hands and her racing pulse, and told herself it meant nothing, that the great were unaccountable, that a man might carry a thing and forget it in the same breath. But her body did not believe her. Her body had begun to know where he was in a room before her eyes confirmed it, the way one knows the direction of a fire by the warmth on one's skin. When he entered the library, her pulse changed its rhythm. When he spoke, low and level, the sound of it traveled down her spine like cool water. She was ashamed of it. She was a maid, and he was an earl, and the distance between them never closed in the world as it was made, and she knew girls who had forgotten that, and what had become of them. She held the thimble in her pocket, and she kept her eyes down, and she did her work. Near the end of November, The household was thrown into the long ordeal of preparation for the Cafford Ball, the great annual event by which the dowager reminded the county of the family's consequence. For a fortnight, the house was turned inside out, the chandeliers lowered and washed crystal by crystal, the floors waxed, the silver counted and recounted, and through all of it, Lady Cafford moved like a general, her satisfaction growing, because there was to be a particular guest, and the guest was the reason for the season's exertions. Her name was Lady Augusta Vane, and she was everything the dowager believed a future Countess of Cafford ought to be. She was the daughter of a marquess. She was 24, fair and polished and accomplished, and she had been raised from the cradle to understand that she was the correct answer to whatever question a great house might ask. She arrived a week before the ball with 3 trunks and a lady's maid of her own, and swept through the rooms of Welborn as though measuring them for her tenure, unfailingly gracious to the servants in the way of a woman told that graciousness to servants is a mark of breeding. Esther saw at once how it was meant to go. The household saw it too. The Earl was to be brought to the point at the ball before the county, and the thing would be settled, and Lady Cafford would have arranged the future to her liking, and the order of the world would be confirmed. Esther told herself that this was nothing to do with her, that it could not touch her, that the ache she felt watching Lady Augusta take the Earl's arm in the gallery was a foolishness she would master. She mastered it. She was good at mastering things. She had had practice. The Earl did not seem like a man being brought to a point. He was courteous to Lady Augusta, and he was distant, and Esther, who had learned to read him a little now, saw that the distance was not shyness, but a door held shut. She told herself this was nothing to her, either. There was a child in the house that no one spoke of. Esther had glimpsed her several times. A small girl of perhaps 6, with the Earl's gray eyes, kept mostly to the nursery wing with a nurse, brought down rarely and quickly taken up again. Her name was Clara. She was the Earl's daughter by his first wife, the late Countess, and the household's silence around her had a quality that Esther recognized, the particular silence that gathers around a grief no one has been permitted to set down. The child was solemn and watchful, and did not play as children play. Once Esther had passed the nursery stair, and heard her asking the nurse in a small, clear voice whether her papa was angry with her, and the nurse had said, "No, of course not, child," in the tone of a woman who did not know the answer. It was Clara who, without intending it, began to undo the door the Earl held shut. Esther found the child one cold afternoon in the long gallery, alone, having slipped her nurse standing before a portrait that hung in the place of honor at the gallery's end. It was the portrait of a young woman in a pale gown, fair-haired, with a sweet, uncertain smile, and Esther knew, without being told, that this was the late Countess, Clara's mother. The child was looking up at it with an expression of such naked longing that Esther's chest tightened. "That is my mamma," Clara said without turning. "She is dead. Everyone is sad about it, but no one will say so. I am not allowed to say so." Esther knelt down on the cold floor beside her, heedless of her apron, heedless of the 50 ways it was improper, and she looked up at the painted face with the child. "She is very beautiful," Esther said. "You have her chin, did you know that?" Clara turned to look at her with the whole of her small attention. "Do I?" "You do?" And her brow. "I think she must have been clever. You can see it about the eyes." The child considered this with great seriousness. "Papa does not look at her picture," she said. "He goes another way down the gallery so he will not have to. I have watched him." She slipped her cold hand into Esther's, as naturally as breathing. "I think he is angry with her for dying. I am angry with her too. And then I am sad that I am angry, and there is no one to tell." "You may tell me," Esther said. "If you like, it is not wicked to be angry and sad at once. I was angry at my own mother for a long while after she died, and I loved her more than anything in the world." Both things were true. Clara stared at her. "Your mamma is dead, too." "She is. And you were angry?" "Very." The child's face worked, and then crumpled. And then she was crying. The deep, abandoned crying of a creature who has waited a long time for permission. And Esther gathered her in and held her on the cold gallery floor beneath the portrait of her mother, and said nothing at all, because some grief wants no words. Only a body to lean against, and the knowledge that it will not be set down. She did not know that the Earl had come into the gallery behind them. She did not know how long he had stood there at the far end, by the door he used, so as not to pass the portrait, watching his daughter weep in the arms of a housemaid for the first time since her mother had died. She did not know that something in him, some long-held thing, had begun in that moment to give way. She knew only that when she finally looked up, Clara quieted against her shoulder, he was there, and his face was not guarded at all, and what was in it frightened her more than his coldness ever had, because it was need, plain and unhidden, and an earl had no business showing such a thing to a maid, and a maid had no business seeing it. He did not speak. He came across the gallery and crouched down the great Earl of Cafford in his fine coat on the floor, and he held out his arms to his daughter, and the child went to him, and he gathered her up and held her hard against him. With his eyes shut, over the child's head he looked at Esther, and the look went on too long, and neither of them ended it. That was the night the wound came out, though it came out slowly, and it came out in the library, where so much between them happened. He sent for her after the house was abed. It was improper past saying, and they both knew it, and she went, because Mrs. Penrose herself brought the message and stood waiting to escort her, and Esther understood that the housekeeper had decided to lend the thing her countenance, which meant the housekeeper had decided something larger that she did not explain. The library was lit by a single branch of candles, and the fire Esther had laid that morning. The Earl stood at the window, where he always stood. "My daughter slept," he said, "for the first time in a great while, without waking. The nurse tells me she asked for you. I am glad of it, my lord. You knelt on the floor with her." "Yes, my lord, no one has done that," he said. "In 3 years no one has done that. They keep her clean and fed, and they take her away when she weeps, because they think her weeping distresses me." He turned, the candlelight caught the side of his face. "It does distress me. Not for the reason they imagine." Esther waited. She had learned that with him the waiting was the kindness. "My wife died of a fever," he said. "In the spring, 3 years past. It was a thing that might have been caught earlier. She had been unwell for some days and made light of it, and I was much occupied, and I did not look closely. By the time the physician was sent for, it was too late to do anything but watch. I have asked myself every day since, whether, had I looked up from my own concerns even once, I might have seen it in time." He said this without self-pity, in the flat, level voice of a man reporting a fact he has long since stopped arguing with. "I did not speak of my grief because it seemed to me I had not earned the right to it. A man who fails to see does not deserve to mourn. So I held my silence, and the house held its silence with me, and my daughter learned that her mother was a thing one did not mention, and I did that to her. I, who would have done anything to spare her. The fire shifted in the grate. Esther's eyes had filled, and she let them, and did not look away. You told her both things were true," he said, "that she might be angry and grieved at once." "I heard you. I have not been able to say that to myself in 3 years. A child of 6 said it to me through your mouth this afternoon, and I do not know what to do with it." He stopped. His hand had risen to the breast of his coat to a flat shape beneath it, and Esther understood that he carried something there, the way she carried the thimble, and that whatever it was his wife. "I do not know why I am telling you this." "Because I told you mine first, my lord," Esther said softly. "On the gallery floor people do. When someone goes first." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Esther," and it was the first time he had used her name, and the sound of it in his voice was a thing she felt in her chest like a struck note, and she sat, and they did not speak for a while. And the not speaking was the most intimate thing that had ever passed between her and another living soul. After that, the winter changed its character. Though nothing was said and nothing was done that the strictest chaperone could have named. The Earl came to the rooms where she worked, and now she let herself know it, and now he let himself be known. He brought Clara to the gallery, and the three of them sat beneath the portrait of the late Countess, and Esther taught the child to see her mother instead of to fear her. He spoke to Esther of his land and his tenants and the things that occupied him, and discovered that she had a clear, practical mind and was not afraid to disagree with him, and the discovering of it gave him an evident pleasure he did not trouble to hide. She told them of her mother, and the cough, and the long winter, and the thimble in her pocket, and he asked to see it. And she put it in his palm, and he turned it over with great gentleness, and gave it back. And his fingers were warm, and they did not quite let go of hers at once. There came an afternoon in the small sitting room where she had been left to mend a torn hanging, when he came in and found her at the window with the light on her face, and he crossed the room as though he meant to say something, and stopped a pace away, closer than he had ever stood, and the thing he had meant to say went out of him. She rose. The hanging slid from her lap. Neither of them moved to retrieve it. He lifted one hand and did not touch her, held it a breath from her face, near enough that she could feel the warmth of his palm against her cheek without contact, and she stood very still, her heart going hard, and she did not step away, which was its own kind of answer. "I have no right to this," he said low. "You are in my house. You depend upon my house. Whatever I feel, you are not free to refuse it without cost, and so I will not ask it of you here, where you cannot freely answer." His hand was still raised, still not touching her. "But I want you to know that I know the difference. I want you to know that I see it. My lord," she said, and her voice was not steady now, at all. "Adrian," he said, "when we are alone, I want to hear it once, Adrian," she said. And the single word, his name in her mouth, undid something in his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. He stepped back. He let his hand fall. He bent and picked up the fallen hanging, and laid it gently across the chair, and he left the room, and she stood at the window with her cheek still warm where he had almost touched it, and understood that she was lost entirely and without remedy, and that there was no version of the world she lived in where this did not end in grief. She was wrong about that, though the grief came first. Lady Cowford had eyes everywhere, and a housemaid who knelt on gallery floors with the heir to the title and was summoned to the library after dark did not escape them long. The dowager did not confront Esther. That was not her way. She arranged. 3 days before the ball, Esther was summoned to the dowager's private sitting room, a warm, rich chamber smelling of dried roses, where Lady Cowford sat very upright in a chair by the fire, with her companion gone and the door shut. "You are an intelligent girl," the dowager said, "so I shall not insult you with indirection. You have made yourself agreeable to my son. I do not entirely blame you. He is a man of feeling who has been a long while in the cold, and you have been warm to him, and to the child. And men in grief mistake warmth for more than it is. Yet you are a housemaid, Esther Whitcomb. You came here in October with one box. My son is to marry Lady Augusta Vane. It is arranged, it is right, and it will happen. The only question that remains is whether you will leave this house with a good character and a sum of money sufficient to establish yourself somewhere far from here, or whether you will oblige me to ensure that you leave it with neither." She named a sum. It was a great deal of money. It was more money than Esther's mother had earned in 5 years of fine work. It would have bought a small shop, a life, a measure of safety Esther had never in her life possessed. "You think me cruel," the dowager said, watching her. "I am not cruel. I am protecting my son from a folly that would ruin him in the eyes of every family of consequence in England. And I am protecting you from a hope that can end only in your disgrace. There is no future here in which you are happy. There is only this future, in which you are comfortable, and the other, in which you are destroyed. I am offering you the kinder one." Esther was quiet for a long moment. She thought of the thimble in her pocket. She thought of her mother's hands, raw, with fine work for other women's daughters. She thought of how much safety the money would buy, and how much she had never had, and how tired she was, underneath everything, of being a person to whom things were done. "You voiced it to me kindly, my lady," she said at last. "But the word you have not said is the word the whole house says. Only a maid. That is what I am to you, a thing that may be paid to go away." She rose. "I will not take your money. Not because I do not want it. I want it very much. I refuse because if I take it, then it is true, what you think of me. And I find that I would rather be poor and true than comfortable and bought." She had thought the dowager would be angry. The dowager was not angry. The dowager smiled, a real smile this time, cold and almost admiring, and said, "Then you have chosen the other future, and you have only yourself to blame for what comes of it," and rang the bell, and Esther was dismissed. What came of it came at the ball. The night of the Cafford ball. Welbourne blazed. Every window poured light onto the gravel sweep. The drive was a river of carriages, the great rooms filled with the county and its silk and its diamonds, and the orchestra played in the gallery while 200 people moved through the warm, bright air beneath the washed chandeliers. Below stairs, the servants ran themselves ragged, and Esther among them, carrying, fetching, invisible, a pair of hands in a plain dark gown moving along the edges of the brilliant rooms. She did not know that the dowager had laid her plan, but she felt the shape of the evening turning wrong. Lady Augusta was radiant in white and silver, placed always near the Earl. The county understood what it was being shown. And midway through the evening, when the great drawing-room was at its fullest, Lady Cafford raised her voice in that effortless way of hers, and brought the room to attention, and announced that she had a small matter to put right before the company, a matter of household honor, and Esther, passing along the wall with a tray, felt the floor drop away beneath her for the third time in her life. The dowager had arranged it beautifully. A piece of the late countess's jewelry, she said, a thing of great sentimental value, had been found that very evening concealed among the possessions of a housemaid. She did not at first say the name. She let the room imagine it. She let the horror gather. And then she summoned Esther forward, before 200 people, into the center of the bright, cruel room, and a footman produced from somewhere a small velvet case, and within it a ring that Esther had never in her life seen, and the dowager said, in her low, carrying voice, that here was the thief, the maid who had come in October with one box and had repaid the family's charity by stealing from the dead. It was masterly. Esther saw the whole of it in an instant. The girl who had defied the dowager over a false accusation would be destroyed by a false accusation, and the symmetry of it would satisfy the dowager's sense of order, and the county would believe it, because the county believed what it was told about housemaids, and there was no companion this time whose room the thing could be found in. Because the thing had been put among Esther's own possessions by someone who served the dowager, and there was no proof, and there was no witness, and there was no one in all that bright room who would speak for a maid against the Countess of Cafford. "Have you anything to say?" the dowager asked, before the magistrate is sent for. The room waited. Lady Augusta had gone pale and still. Mrs. Penrose stood at the edge of the room with her closed account-book face and her hands folded. And Esther, in the center of it all, found that her hands were not trembling. She thought with a strange calm that she had been here before, that she had stood at a graveside and understood that a truth could not be set down, and that she would rather be destroyed standing than saved on her knees. "I did not take the ring," she said. Her voice carried further than she expected. "I have never seen it. I came here with one box, and that is true, and in the box was a thimble that belonged to my mother, who was a seamstress, and who died poor, and who taught me that a person's worth is not the number of their boxes. You may send for the magistrate, my lady. Yet I did not take the ring, and you know that I did not, because you know exactly where it has been until tonight." It was the most anyone had ever said against the dowager in that house, in that county, in living memory. The room rustled with the shock of it. And it would not have been enough. A maid's word was a maid's word. And the dowager had only to look pained and aggrieved and let the magistrate do the rest, and the evening would have ended as she had designed it. But across the room the Earl of Cafford set down his glass. He did it without haste, He set it on the tray of a passing footman, and he crossed the great drawing room, and the crowd parted before him, because crowds always part before a man who walks, as though the floor is his, and he did not stop until he stood beside Esther in the center of the room, close, his shoulder nearly touching hers, facing his mother before the whole astonished county. The room went so silent that the orchestra in the gallery, which had not been told to stop, faltered and fell, still of its own accord. The Earl looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he reached into the breast of his coat to the flat shape he always carried there, and he drew it out. And it was a small framed miniature of his late wife, which he had carried against his heart for 3 years and shown to no one. He held it up so that his mother could see it, and so that the room could. "My wife," he said, "is the only person who ever owned that ring, and she gave it, before she died, to be kept for our daughter. It has been in my own keeping these 3 years, in a box only I unlock. It was in that box this morning. I looked." He let the silence work. "So I should be glad, mother, to hear how it came to be among the possessions of a maid, when it has never left my keeping at all." The dowager's fan stopped. Her face, which had not changed in the great hall, which had not changed when Esther refused her money, changed now. It was a small change, a faint slackening at the jaw, a flicker of the eyes toward the velvet case and away from it. But in that room of people who had spent their lives reading exactly such faces, it was a confession, and they read it, and a sound went through the crowd like wind through a field. The Earl turned from his mother. He looked at Esther, in her plain dark gown, in the center of the bright room, and he took her hand, her work-roughened hand, in both of his, before 200 people, and he said the thing that ended it. "This is the woman I mean to marry." 7 words. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain, or argue, or defend. He simply claimed her, in the same room where his mother had tried to destroy her, before the same county that had been assembled to witness a different betrothal, and the 7 words fell into the silence, and could not be unsaid. Esther did not hear the room erupt, though it did. She heard only the blood in her own ears, and felt only his hands around hers, warm and certain, and she looked up into his face and found there no guard at all, only a man who had at last looked up from his own concerns in time and had decided that he would not be too late again. Lady Augusta Vane, to the surprise of every one and her own lasting credit, was the first to move. She crossed to the dowager and took the older woman's arm, not gently, and said something low and private that no one heard, and led her from the room. And it was understood by all that the Marquess's daughter had no wish to be the prize in a contest that had just been so publicly decided, and that she had, moreover, seen something she did not care to be on the wrong side of. The county would say afterward that Lady Augusta had behaved beautifully. She had. She had also been the only person in the room quick enough to spare the dowager the indignity of standing alone in the wreck of her own scheme, and the dowager, who understood debts, never forgot it. The magistrate was not sent for. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church on the estate, with the tenants in the pews, and Mary Tace weeping happily in the second row, and Mrs. Penrose standing very straight, with suspicious brightness about her closed account-book eyes. The dowager did not attend. She had removed to the dower house at the far end of the park, where she received few visitors and wrote many letters, and where, in time, something in her did soften, though never enough to be called an apology, only enough that when her son brought the child Clara to visit, she let the girl sit on her footstool. The correct way to hold a fan, it was the nearest thing to love. The dowager knew how to give, and the child, who had learned that winter to take love in whatever form it came, accepted it gladly. Esther never became grand. She tried, for the county's sake, and she managed the manners and the calls and the dinners with the same steady competence. She had brought to laying fires, but she never lost the habit of kneeling on floors with children, or the trick of going first, when someone needed to be told that 2 things could be true at once. The tenants loved her. The servants who had watched it all told the story below stairs for years, The story of the new maid who did the unthinkable, and the telling of it changed something in the house. Some understanding of what was and was not a law. On a cold evening the following winter, with the snow coming down soft and steady past the long windows, and a fire burning in the library grate, that Esther no longer laid herself. She sat with Adrian on the floor before the hearth, which was not at all how a countess was meant to sit. With Clara asleep against her side, and the child's small hand curled around something she had begged to hold. It was the thimble. The brass one, worn smooth at the crown, that had come in a box in October with everything Esther owned. Clara had asked for it at bedtime, and Esther had given it, and the child had fallen asleep holding it as though it were a great treasure, which Esther thought, watching the snow and the fire and the sleeping child and the man beside her whose head had come to rest against her shoulder it was. It had steadied her hand through every hard thing. It had been her mother's, and her mother had been right. A person's worth was not the number of their boxes. It was the things you would not set down, and the truths you would not swallow, and the floors you were willing to kneel upon for someone who had no one else. The fire settled. The snow went on. Esther closed her fingers around the child's hand, around the thimble, and did not let go.